Elijah wiped the grease from his hands as the clock struck 6. After a long day at the auto repair shop, his mind was set on one thing: his sister Mia's birthday dinner. She had been planning it for weeks, and Elijah knew how much it meant to her. Grabbing his worn-out jacket, he hurried out, determined not to be late. The subway was its usual chaos. People jostled for space, their faces tired and expressionless after a day of work. Elijah squeezed his way into the crowded train, his eyes scanning for a spot to stand. As the doors slid shut, he noticed a woman leaning against a pole, her hand resting protectively on her pregnant belly. She looked pale, her breath shallow. Without hesitation, Elijah stood up. "Ma'am, please, take my seat," he offered with a warm smile. The woman hesitated, her eyes darting between Elijah and the seat. "Thank you," she murmured, lowering herself carefully. Elijah steadied her with a gentle hand on her arm before stepping back to grip a nearby pole. Around him, a few passengers nodded in approval, though most remained engrossed in their own worlds. As the train lurched forward, Elijah's thoughts wandered to Mia. He couldn't wait to see the look on her face when she opened the gift he had saved up for: a charm bracelet engraved with her favorite quote. The simple act of kindness he had just performed only added to the sense of optimism swelling within him. It was going to be a good evening. The train screeched to a halt at the next station, jolting passengers out of their reverie. Elijah barely had time to steady himself when a commotion erupted near the seat he had given up. The pregnant woman was slumped over, her face ashen, her hands clutching her chest. "Help! She's not breathing properly!" a man shouted, his voice panicked. Chaos ensued. People scrambled to make room, their movements frantic as they called out for help. Elijah's heart pounded as he pushed through the crowd and crouched beside her. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" he asked urgently, his voice steady despite the panic around him. The woman's eyelids fluttered, her breathing shallow. "Water, please," she managed to whisper before her head lolled to the side. Elijah turned to the crowd. "Does anyone have water?" he shouted. A young woman passed him a bottle, which he carefully tipped to the woman's lips. The train conductor's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing that paramedics had been called and would meet them at the next station. The minutes stretched endlessly. Elijah stayed by the woman's side, his presence a calm amidst the storm. He held her hand, offering quiet words of reassurance even as fear gripped him. The passengers whispered among themselves, their anxiety palpable. As the train began moving again, the woman stirred, her voice barely audible. He did something," she rasped, her words slurred. Elijah froze. "What? No, I was only trying to help." But her words had already spread like wildfire. The passengers around them exchanged alarmed glances, their whispers turning into murmurs of suspicion. Elijah's chest tightened as he realized what was happening. "I swear, I didn't," he began, but the doubt in their eyes was unmistakable. By the time the train reached the station, the situation had spiraled. As paramedics rushed in to assist the woman, a passenger turned to Elijah with an accusatory glare. "Why were you so close to her? What did you do?" Elijah opened his mouth to protest, but the words stuck in his throat. How had his act of kindness turned into this nightmare? The bustling platform fell silent as the paramedics lifted the pregnant woman onto a stretcher. Elijah stood frozen, his hands raised slightly, as if to ward off the piercing gazes directed his way. The woman's earlier words echoed in his mind, though they had been weak and disjointed. He did something. A middle-aged man with a stern expression stepped forward, pointing a finger at Elijah. "I saw him crouched over her just before she said that. What were you doing?" "I was checking to see if she was okay," Elijah replied, his voice trembling slightly. He tried to meet the man's eyes, but the growing crowd around him seemed to close in, their suspicion thick in the air. "She said you did something," a woman in a red scarf snapped, her voice sharp with accusation. "We all heard it." Elijah's heart raced as he tried to explain. "I offered her my seat when I saw she was struggling. That's it. I didn't touch her belongings or do anything to harm her." But the murmurs around him grew louder. Why was he crouching so close then? Why did she accuse him if he didn't do anything? Two uniformed transit officers pushed through the crowd, their presence commanding silence. "What's going on here?" one of them asked, his gaze settling on Elijah. The red scarf woman stepped forward, eager to recount her version of events. That woman collapsed, And then she accused this man. He was right next to her. That's not true, Elijah protested, his voice rising. I was only trying to help. Check the security footage if you don't believe me. The officers exchanged glances before addressing him. Sir, we need you to come with us for questioning, one said, his tone firm but measured. Elijah felt the eyes of the passengers on him, their judgment palpable. He wanted to scream, to plead with them to see reason, but he knew it would only make things worse. Instead, he followed the officers off the train, his stomach churning with frustration and disbelief. The small transit office was cold and unwelcoming. Elijah sat stiffly on a metal chair, his hands resting on the table before him. The officers stood across from him, their questions pointed and unrelenting. What was your interaction with the woman before she collapsed? One of them asked. Elijah recounted the events, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. She looked unwell, so I offered her my seat. That's all. When she collapsed, I tried to help. I didn't touch her or do anything inappropriate. One of the officers raised an eyebrow. And why do you think she accused you? I don't know, Elijah exclaimed, his frustration bubbling to the surface. She was barely conscious. She might have been confused or disoriented. I only wanted to make sure she was okay. The officers exchanged skeptical glances before stepping out of the room to confer privately. Through the glass partition, Elijah could see the crowd on the platform growing larger. The woman in the red scarf was animatedly gesturing, her words fueling the speculation of onlookers. Elijah's fists clenched as he replayed the scene in his mind. Had he made a mistake by getting involved? He thought of his sister, waiting for him at home, and the charm bracelet still tucked in his pocket. Would he even make it to dinner? The door opened, and the officers re-entered. Before they could speak, a voice called out from the hallway. Wait! I have proof! A teenage girl stepped into the room, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. She looked nervous but determined as she approached the officers. I was recording when it happened, she said. You need to see this. Elijah's heart lifted slightly as the officers took the phone and began reviewing the footage. The seconds dragged on, each one stretching into an eternity as he waited for their verdict. The officers leaned over the teenager's phone, their expressions unreadable as they watched the video. Elijah sat tensely, his heart pounding in his chest. He could barely breathe as the teenager, no older than 16, with wide, earnest eyes, explained what she had captured. I was sitting a few seats away, she said, her voice steady but soft. I saw him give up his seat for the woman. He didn't do anything wrong. He wasn't even near her when she collapsed. The officers replayed the footage, their eyes narrowing as they examined the scene closely. The video clearly showed Elijah standing after offering his seat, holding onto a pole a few steps away. When the woman collapsed, it captured him rushing forward to help, his actions cautious and measured. There, the girl said, pointing at the screen. See? He didn't touch her belongings, and he wasn't close to her until she needed help. One of the officers sighed, setting the phone down. This helps, he admitted, though his tone was hesitant. But we still need to address the woman's statement. Elijah stood, his frustration barely contained. She was barely conscious when she said that. It's obvious she was confused. How much more proof do you need? The officers exchanged glances, their indecision palpable. Outside the room, the murmurs of the crowd on the platform continued to grow. Elijah could feel their suspicion lingering like a storm cloud, no matter what the video showed. The teenager stepped forward, her eyes fierce. You can't keep treating him like this when the truth is right here. That woman needs help, not more assumptions. He didn't do anything wrong. Elijah glanced at her, gratitude welling up inside him. Despite her courage, the officers remained cautious, their training making them wary of dismissing any possibility too quickly. Let's get the woman's medical condition clarified, one officer finally said. That might clear things up further. The paramedics had moved the pregnant woman to a quieter corner of the platform, where they worked diligently to stabilize her. Elijah could see them from the window, their swift movements betraying their focus. A senior paramedic approached the officers, clipboard in hand. The woman's condition was caused by a severe drop in blood pressure, he explained. She's been under a lot of stress and hasn't eaten properly. That's what caused her to faint. It had nothing to do with anyone else. Relief flooded Elijah, but it was short-lived. The The officer who had spoken earlier frowned. "She still accused him of something," he said. "We can't ignore that." The paramedic shook his head. "She was disoriented and confused when she made those statements. It's common for patients in her condition to misinterpret their surroundings or experiences. What she said isn't reliable." The explanation should have been enough to clear Elijah's name, but the tension in the air remained. Outside, a woman in a red coat continued to stir doubts among the crowd. "He might have done something before the video started," she insisted, her voice cutting through the din. "How do we know for sure?" Elijah's frustration boiled over. "Check the security footage from the train," he demanded. "It'll prove I didn't do anything wrong. Why is it so hard to believe I was just trying to help?" The officers nodded reluctantly and made arrangements to review the footage. Elijah leaned back in his chair, exhaustion settling in. Though the paramedic's diagnosis had absolved him of any involvement in the woman's collapse, the shadow of suspicion lingered, cast by the assumptions of strangers who refused to let go of their doubts. Through it all, the teenager remained by his side, her presence a small but significant comfort. "You'll be okay," she said quietly. "The truth always comes out, even if it takes time." Elijah managed a faint smile. "I hope you're right." The minutes dragged on as the officers coordinated to retrieve the train's security footage. Elijah sat silently, his head in his hands, feeling the weight of every judgmental glance from the growing crowd outside. The teenager stood close, a quiet but unwavering supporter. Through the glass partition, Elijah saw a woman in a bright red coat speaking animatedly to a group of passengers. Her voice was loud enough to carry into the room. "I'm telling you, he was too close to her the whole time," she said, her tone dripping with certainty. "Why would she say he did something if he didn't?" Another passenger nodded in agreement. "He should have just stayed out of it. People don't collapse for no reason." Elijah's jaw tightened. He had tried to do the right thing, yet here he was, being vilified for it. One of the officers returned, motioning for him to step outside. "We're working on getting the footage," the officer said, his voice neutral. "But until then, you'll need to wait here." Elijah stood, his frustration simmering just beneath the surface. "How long is this going to take? My sister's waiting for me. I have a life too, you know." The officer hesitated, clearly torn between procedure and sympathy. "I understand, but we need to follow protocol." Outside, the woman in the red coat pointed at Elijah as he stepped onto the platform. "There he is," she declared, her words sparking another wave of murmurs. Elijah raised his voice, his patience wearing thin. "I didn't do anything wrong. The paramedics already said her collapse had nothing to do with me." "That doesn't mean you didn't do something before," the red-coated woman shot back. "Why are you so defensive if you're innocent?" Elijah felt a surge of anger but forced himself to remain calm. "Because no one's listening to the truth," he said firmly. "I gave her my seat, and when she collapsed, I tried to help. That's all." The teenager stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension. "I have a video that proves he didn't do anything wrong. Why are you still accusing him?" The woman faltered for a moment but quickly recovered. "Videos don't show everything," she muttered. The officers returned, this time holding a tablet. "We've got the security footage," one announced, drawing everyone's attention. The officers played the footage on the tablet, and a hush fell over the crowd as they gathered around to watch. The video showed the interior of the subway car from multiple angles, offering a clear view of the events. There was Elijah, standing near the door as the train started moving. He noticed the pregnant woman struggling and offered his seat, stepping back to give her space. For the next several minutes, he remained by the pole, keeping a respectful distance. When the woman collapsed, the footage showed Elijah rushing forward, his movements careful and deliberate as he crouched beside her to check if she was okay. "See?" the teenager said, her voice triumphant. "He didn't do anything wrong." The officers nodded, their expressions softening. "This confirms your story," one said to Elijah. "You're free to go." Elijah felt a wave of relief, but it was quickly overshadowed by the lingering tension. The crowd didn't disperse immediately, and the red-coated woman crossed her arms, looking unconvinced. "He's lucky the footage was clear," she muttered, loud enough for Elijah to hear. Elijah turned to her, his voice steady but firm. "No, I'm not lucky. I was honest from the beginning, but people like you refuse to believe me. Next time, think before you judge someone." The woman looked away, her face flushing with embarrassment. As the crowd finally began to thin, Elijah took a deep breath. The ordeal was over, but the sting of the experience remained. The teenager approached him, offering a small smile. "I'm glad it worked out," she said. "Me too," Elijah replied. "Thank you for standing up for me. It meant a lot." She shrugged, her cheeks pink. It was the right thing to do. Elijah nodded, his resolve hardening. He had been vindicated, but the day had left a mark, one that would take time to heal. As the subway station emptied out and the tension finally dissipated, Elijah stepped outside into the crisp evening air. The weight of the ordeal clung to him like an unwelcome shadow. The teenager had gone her way after exchanging a few encouraging words, and now Elijah stood alone, replaying the events in his mind. Despite being cleared of any wrongdoing, the sting of being falsely accused lingered. The whispers, the glares, and the way people had assumed the worst of him, it all felt unjust. He glanced at his watch and realized he was already late for his sister's birthday dinner. Making his way toward the nearest bus stop, Elijah's phone buzzed. A notification popped up, a link to a video posted online. It was the teenager's recording of the incident, accompanied by a heartfelt caption: "Kindness shouldn't be met with suspicion. This man did nothing but help, and yet he was judged unfairly. Let's do better." The video had already garnered hundreds of views and comments. Elijah scrolled through, his emotions a mix of gratitude and frustration. Some comments condemned the crowd for jumping to conclusions, while others applauded the teenager for stepping up. One comment stood out: "This video reminds me to check my biases. I'm sorry for the times I've misjudged others." Elijah's lips twitched into a small smile. Perhaps, in some small way, this incident could spark change. By the time he arrived at his sister's house, the dinner was in full swing. Laughter and the scent of home-cooked food greeted him as he stepped inside. His sister, Mia, rushed over, her expression a mix of relief and concern. "Elijah, you're late. What happened?" she asked. Elijah hesitated before saying, "It's a long story." As the evening wore on, Elijah found himself at the dinner table surrounded by family, the warmth of their presence a stark contrast to the cold judgment he had faced earlier. Between bites of cake and teasing exchanges, Mia finally pressed him for details about his tardiness. Elijah recounted the incident, his voice calm but tinged with lingering frustration. He explained how his small act of kindness spiraled into chaos, how the accusations had shaken him, and how the teenager's courage had ultimately cleared his name. Mia's expression shifted from disbelief to anger. "That's so unfair," she said, her fists clenching. "You were just trying to help, and they treated you like a criminal." "I know," Elijah replied. "But it's over now. The truth came out." "But it shouldn't have happened in the first place," Mia insisted. "You shouldn't have to defend yourself for being kind." Elijah nodded, her words resonating deeply. "You're right, it shouldn't have happened, but it made me realize something important." "What's that?" Mia asked. "That kindness is still worth it," Elijah said, his gaze steady. "Even if it's misunderstood, even if people judge me for it, someone has to challenge the way we make assumptions about others. And maybe, by doing that, we can make the world a little better." Mia's eyes softened, and she reached across the table to squeeze his hand. "You're a better person than most, Elijah. Don't let this change who you are." Elijah smiled, the tension in his chest easing. "I won't." Later that night, as he lay in bed, Elijah reflected on the day. Though it had been one of the most difficult experiences of his life, it had also reaffirmed his values. He thought of the teenager's bravery, the lessons shared in the comments on her video, and the power of standing firm in the face of adversity. With that, Elijah drifted off to sleep, carrying with him a renewed sense of purpose, to keep being kind, to stay true to himself, and to challenge the assumptions that divide us all. Elijah's journey on that fateful day was one of pain, resilience, and ultimately, hope. What began as a simple act of kindness spiraled into a test of his character, exposing the harsh realities of judgment and suspicion in the world. Yet, through it all, Elijah remained steadfast. The ordeal taught him that kindness is not always met with gratitude, but that doesn't diminish its value. It showed him that standing firm in the face of adversity can inspire others to reflect, to learn, and to change. The teenager's courage and the outpouring of support from strangers online reminded Elijah that even in moments of darkness, there are sparks of light. Those who stand for truth and justice, no matter how small their voice, can make a difference. As Elijah moved forward, he carried with him a renewed commitment to kindness, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. His experience became a quiet but powerful reminder to those around him that assumptions can harm, and compassion has the power to heal. In the end, Elijah's story was not just about a single act of kindness, but about the strength it takes to hold on to hope in a world so quick to judge. It was a testament to the power of empathy, the courage to stand up for what's right, and the enduring belief that despite its flaws, humanity is capable of change. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch and experience Elijah's story. Your support means the world to us, and we hope this journey has inspired you as much as it has inspired us. The message of kindness, standing up for what's right, and challenging assumptions is something we can all carry with us. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your engagement helps spread important stories like Elijah's and encourages others to reflect on their own actions. We appreciate every one of you who has followed along, commented, and shared your thoughts. Together, we can create a world where kindness is always valued and assumptions are challenged. Thank you once again, and stay kind.